Good morning, everyone. So before we start, may I ask us just to be quiet, to calm down, listen to your breathing as you breathe in and out, and let us be aware of the presence of one another. We are in the presence of one another, our connection to the environment, to nature, to all that makes us human. Just a few seconds of quiet. We thank God, our Creator. We thank God for the opportunity to be here. We thank God for the moment and commend this session to God. We ask the Spirit to enlighten all of us that whatever we do here may be to the greater glory of God and of creation. Amen.
Amen.
So
Thank you so much.
yes,
Thank you.
we are glad, we give floor to Professor Akim Venman, our host, to welcome us. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much, and thank you to all of you to be here today. I'm Akin Benwell. I'm the Director for Strategic Partnerships at the Graduate Institute here, and I'm also a professor in the interdisciplinary department where I hold the Nagulendran Chair in Peace Mediation. I think just for those of you who might not know the Geneva Graduate Institute, we are a boutique university dedicated to the study of international affairs. We have about 1,200 students from all over the world that study in both disciplinary masters or PhDs in international law, sociology, political science, economics, and so forth. But also we have an interdisciplinary master's where we focus on a number of the issues that make up the day-to-day work of international law, from human rights to global health to peace and security, and so forth. So we've been in existence for the last 100 years, nearly. We celebrate our 100th anniversary in next year. We've been founded as a think tank to the League of Nations and have then evolved into this small university which we are now. We have 80 professors and are part of the makeup of International Geneva. We are both as an intellectual magnet, but also as a convener. You see the location of where we are in the middle of International Geneva, but we have also very strong links to Geneva proper with our history, with some of our founders and funders from Geneva. So we are a very good space in between to find solutions and to most of all nudge those who want to change the world in the right direction. Which brings us to, of course, this discussion here on reflecting on what next directions there can be with respect to helping nature has voice. Nature can be protected, and giving essentially nature also a possibility to have its own agency, to represent and negotiate with others. So when Hugo first presented these reflections in this very room as part of a project which is the Geneva Policy Outlook, copies of which you have in front of you, we thought this is a topic that is relevant and important for Geneva, because this can be one of the lines of how this city adapts to a radically changing world. On the one hand, you have global challenges and problems that are much bigger than any institutions on its own. Many formal UN entities are overwhelmed with dealing with them, particularly in a moment where powerful actors are undermining its work. And this is where we live in a moment where we need to go, not just think out of the box, but go outside of the box in order to see how do we need to redo diplomacy in order to make sure some of the most important global commons are protected and enabled. So We do this with Nature with Hugo. We also have a track on giving voice to the younger populations with the establishment of the Geneva Youth Hub, which another colleague is leading. We also have worked a lot on the notion of constructing a networked multilateralism to network different global hubs together, not just looking at the institutional manifestations within the UN system, but also thinking about global and policy ecosystems and how to connect these in order to link those actors with agency for change together. Welcome to the Grad Institute. Director Marie-Laure Salle would have liked to be here today. She is traveling, unfortunately, but she sends her greetings to all of you, and I look very much forward to meeting all of you here today. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Vena, and thank you again all for being here. We are here to take a crack on a very important and interesting topic, nature as diplomat. And Dr. Hugo's main argument, which is sent out, is that nature should have a direct diplomatic presence in a multilateral diplomacy, not merely as a topic for discussion, but should be treated as a political actor with representation, status, and voice in international governance. So as a foundation, we need to recognize nature as an entity, a living organism. And from that platform, we can truly affirm nature's rights akin to other rights recognized and affirmed by the United Nations. So let me turn first to two things. One, indigenous worldviews, and two, religion. The indigenous worldviews of the peoples of Africa, of South America, North America as well, and across the world, and Judeo-Christian tradition and other faiths have something to say. And these can provide the anchor for understanding of the earth's, I use the word personhood, as a person, personhood. So let me make a quick highlight of these worldviews. I begin by stating a fact that is held commonly with the traditions I've cited. In this context, nature is a symphony of integral, mutually dependent ecology, of which humans are a part of it. So that's the background. So most indigenous cultures see and relate to nature as a living organism. I'm not talking about animism here. We are talking about people establishing relationship with fellow creation. It is the understanding that nature brings forth life, it sustains life, it regenerates life, and in many traditional cultures, it holds the sacred remains of the ancestors, and therefore holds a special place in the community of persons and in the life of each and every one. So that's the context. In that context, indigenous cultures see the earth as mother. You know, Africans are very good at that, saying Mother Africa, you know, Mother Africa as mother. Within the Judeo-Christian tradition, the story of creation brings this out succinctly. We read in Genesis, the very beginning of the scripture, that God created first the heavens and the earth, and then after creating, God then said, let the earth bring forth seeds, plants, seed-bearing plants, fruit trees, tiny frogs, etc. Bring forth life. I remember at a conference in Nairobi, it was a conference on Laudato Si, and the keynote speaker, Professor Aniedi Okure, whom I happen to know, was the keynote speaker addressing the conference. And at one point, she was quoting this Genesis, God creating and saw that everything was good. Then she took a pause for about 5 seconds. And we were wondering whether she forgot her train of thought. But no, she stopped and said, you know what? In God's design, nature, the earth especially, is a living organism. It is for that reason that, according to scripture, God commanded the earth to produce life. And so if the earth in creation, in the context of creation, was not a living organism, God would not have commanded it to bring forth life. It hit me well, and I think we need to have that as a background. And scripture tells us two things following. One, that after creation, God saw that all that was created was good. Good in that context, wholesome, integral, interrelated and interconnected. So it's working well. It's not just, oh, good, as we understand it. So it's good. So nature by itself is an integral whole, a harmony of diversity in an ecological symphony. Without this diversity, we perish. So waging war on nature is self-destructive. We also learn in Genesis chapter 2, verse 14, that after creation, God picked the human Adam, placed it in the middle of the garden to, quote, take care of it, to cultivate, that is, beautify it, and take care of it. And so the earth, I repeat again, brings forth life, supports life, regenerates life. So this roundtable builds on the proposition that the next frontier of multilateralism lies in extending diplomacy beyond the international community towards an earth community. That's the argument from our presenter, which he will highlight it. And the planet and are meaningfully represented in governance and decision making. In effect, and given the foregoing, we hope to articulate the Earth's, I repeat again, personhood, in quotation mark, such that it merits a seat at the table and be represented with rights. We hear already Ecuador, Bolivia have already instituted legal action given the earth, personhood and the right to sue you if you violate the earth's right. That's a good thing. So among the key questions we will be addressed today is, what would it mean in practical terms for nature to have a seat at the table next to Professor Binman there, there's an empty seat there? What would it mean, And what role can Geneva-based actors, the international organizations, the academia, the NGOs play in advancing this agenda? So to lead us in this discussion is our eminent Professor Hugo Slim, Director of Las Casas Institute at Oxford University, and is also a member of the board of directors for Dominicans for Justice and Peace. His work on humanitarian ethics and earth emergency is part of the base for this conceptual anchor for the conversation. Joining us online for input from a theological background, so we don't go heretical, two theologians. First, we have Professor Anthony Akinwale. Is there a way of showing him? Professor Anthony Akinwale is a professor of systematic theology and president of St. Augustine's University in Lagos, and previously was the president of the Dominican University and has been a consultant to the Conference of Catholic Bishops Conference in Nigeria. The second person is another theologian, Dr. Jean-Claude, a member of the Dominican Lay Fraternity, and is the advocacy officer for Dominicans for Justice and Peace at the UN Environmental Program in Nairobi. So with that, I turn over the, Akinwale, could you wave your hand so we are seeing you? Okay, all right. And Dr. John Claude, could you wave your hand so we see you? Okay, thank you very much. So with that, I turn the table to Dr. Hugo. Please, Dr. Hugo.
Aniedi, thank you very much. And Akim, thank you very much for hosting us at the Graduate Institute. And we talked about nature being at the table. And yesterday we realized we are in such a modernist, techno-industrialist space that one of the graduate students brought this beautiful flower from her garden and said, at least nature will be at the table. And it has stayed alive from our roundtable yesterday for you today. So that's great. It would be lovely to go around the table as well and a little bit more on the screen and see who we are. So I'm Hugo Slim from Blackfriars Hall at the University of Oxford. Inka?
I'm Inka Papa, Program Coordinator of Dominicans for Justice and Peace.
I'm Kachi Abin, CSSP. I represent Vivat International at the UN. Happily today is my birthday, so I've come here because there are so many.
Well, happy birthday. Great. Sister.
Sarah Garcia, you're from the Philippines. I'm a Salesian sister of Don Bosco, and I represent here in the UN the two organizations actually, with ECOSOC status, IIMA, which is the Institute of the Daughters of Mary Help of Christians, and our voluntary wing, which is BDS International.
Sister Franca.
I am Franca Edets. I am a daughter of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul, and I'm representing my religious order at the United Nations here in Geneva. Thank you.
Akim, we know.
Hello everyone, Torsten Goebel, Act Alliance, Action by Churches Together.
Hi, I'm Rachel Tabner, also with Act Alliance. I'm the Global Advocacy and Policy Manager. Great to be here.
Good morning to you all. I'm Michel Anglade. I'm the representative of Jesuit Refugee Service here in Geneva.
I'm Ewan McMullen. I'm a Franciscan friar from the 16th European Program Coordinator for Franciscans International.
Christopher Bellatorre, and I'm supporting the Franciscan International Advocacy Team.
Hello, I'm Johanna Korenkova. I work for Franciscan International as a finance officer.
Hello everyone, I'm Blair from Franciscans International.
And
Cynthia Langoulet from the Movement for Justice and Peace Project Manager.
And Lucas.
Hello, I'm with the GPO for the Diplomat initiative for the last few weeks.
And we've got other people on the screen. I can't read from him. And maybe Akim, you can read and ask them to say hello. So
Frederick Ifanji Obananya.
Okay.
Father Frederick.
Please unmute yourself.
I think he's making coffee.
Okay.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm Father Frederick Ifeanyi Obanaya. I'm the Dominican African promoter for justice and peace in Africa.
Thanks,
Thank
Frederick.
You. Yeah.
I can't.
We'll keep going. So I go from the top. Cynthia.
No,
Cynthia's here. She's here. We've had Father. We've had Anthony. We've had Jean-Claude, so it's the lady.
Manjaela Nicholas. Hello, nice to meet you.
I am Sister Taskila, representing the Good Shepherd Sisters at UN, Geneva, and we work, thank you.
Great.
And we have Elena Cedia.
Hello, colleagues. My name is Elena Cedillo. I am from the Lutheran World Federation based in Geneva.
Pleasure to meet you. Alex Gosens-Ishii.
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Alex Gosens-Ishii from Soka Gakkai International, based in Geneva as well.
And Valeriane, you will need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Valeriane Bernard, and I represent the Brahma Kumaris in Geneva and other forums.
Excellent. And then we have Annetta Loy. Annetta?
No, never mind.
Lutheran World Federation.
Yeah, we've heard them. Yeah.
And we have the AI notes.
Yeah.
Can you present yourself, please?
Brilliant. Well, look, thank you. It's a lovely group of Catholics and Protestants and Buddhists. Lovely to have the Buddhists with us as well. And thank you for coming, and thank you all for joining in. As Akim and Aniedi said, I'm interested in pushing this idea at the moment of nature as diplomat, of giving nature more direct diplomatic presence, performance, representation here in Geneva, and I hope worldwide eventually. So our purpose today is to explore if and how nature in its various forms can achieve more formal and direct diplomatic status. And so the question is really, and this was the question we were asking our roundtable of states and nature agencies and academics yesterday, is could and should nature have diplomats, embassies, flags of its own? And could and should faith-based diplomats, this is for our roundtable today, faith-based diplomats like you, support such an initiative? And if so, how? I mean, we realize faith-based initiatives have brought so many innovations into international diplomacy in the last thousands of years, actually. So if this is an idea you'd like to support, how could a faith-based track support this at the United Nations with states with another track? And just to think about our context for this, really, of course, I'm thinking very much, and this feeling emerged from my work on climate emergency for the humanitarian sector. We live in today, and it's pretty obvious today, in a climate emergency. But we also live in a nature emergency, where there's extraordinary biodiversity loss, biodiversity risk from climate increasingly, but also traditionally from humankind and from our own use and abuse of the earth. And I put those two things together and talk about us really at this moment being in an earth emergency, in the way that Aniedi talked about the earth being in an earth emergency. Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, fine. So they can't see me. That's a blessing. Now you've got to look at me. And of course, as Aniedi also said, survival in an earth emergency or in the earth at any time is a survival of all life. And we will only succeed in the survival of all life in a joint project of survival between humanity and nature. And it has always been thus, and it is urgently thus today. And we know, we can go back to Genesis and show, the second Genesis, well, the earlier Genesis tradition of humans being created out of the earth, out of the mud, that in fact we are always never just a human species that floats above the earth. We are always a hybrid form of life. We always live a life with and in nature, and we are always water humans and wheat humans and rice humans and cheese humans in Switzerland. And we are always nature-based. And therefore, I think it's incredibly important at this particular moment in the history of the earth that we raise the status of nature as diplomat, and we give it more presence and performance and representation in our diplomacy. And of course, Geneva has a great tradition of doing this for marginalized forms of human life, like wounded soldiers, like refugees, like children who have gradually recognized and given status, indigenous people who had to come here right in the 1920s with the League of Nations and argue for their diplomatic place. And of course, our own communities of faith have also insisted and argued for a sort of transboundary status in diplomacy and achieved it, which is why you're all here sitting at the United Nations. I think we need to do this for nature now in a more formal, structured way. So just to go through the paper in case you haven't read it, this was a paper I wrote really for these two roundtables, and Akim and I plan to produce a more finished, fuller paper for the COP17 in Yerevan in October. So it's time for nature to have diplomatic status. There's a history of diplomatic tradition throughout the millennia and centuries, but particularly in Geneva. Nature already, over the last 30, 40, 50, 60 years, has achieved a new international persona. And in fact, one could talk of an international prestige. There are lots of treaties about nature which intrinsically value nature and want to protect it and give it international persona, international prestige. We can see also that sometimes nature is treated very seriously internationally as an international enemy. It has inimical prestige if it's COVID or if it's the mosquito that carries malaria and things. So nature has international status and it should have more, in my view. And that leads us to the question of how can nature be a diplomat? And in the paper, I say that's really no more ridiculous idea or difficult idea than saying, how can India or Nigeria be a diplomat? And we say to ourselves, we have Nigeria in the room or we have India in the room, but we know that actually Nigeria is really in West Africa and that India is in the Indian Ocean. And they're not really here. They're represented here. They're performed here in a certain way by a representative, an intermediary of some kind. And we know that diplomatic representation is, and we can talk about it in sacramental language if we want to, in a sense. We know it's always symbolic in a way and as much fictional and a commitment to imagination and performance as it is literal and real. So I think we need to do this for nature now in a much more direct way. And we looked in the paper at various mechanisms for doing this. Guardians of nature, which are established in many ways, environmental defenders, like some people in your movements, some people more formally recognized. The idea of nature councils and nature embassies, interspecies councils, where we sit around the table and we make a sort of almost contemplative commitment to connect with nature and try and bring its needs and concerns to the table, partly through a sort of interspecies empathic commitment, as indeed a diplomat would do about their country or understanding another country, listening to that country. But also from science to policy, S2P, as we say, bringing science we know about nature to the table as well, in some ways. Animal diplomats. They're very interesting people who work, a French philosopher called Baptiste Morisot, who's a very applied philosopher who works with wolves, and he spends his life living and walking and skiing with wolves to understand them, to think. It means he affects to call them like a wolf, and he tries to live amongst them and really understand their needs as if it were a neighboring state, and he calls this wild diplomacy. And the best way he's ever found to describe his job of trying to understand a sovereign neighbor of some kind, wolves and wolves' territory, and represent them back is as a diplomat. So there are those kind of animal diplomats. There's the idea of nature as a shareholder, that we could actually say the Amazon owns itself. So in some way, if you are engaged with taking resources, using resources from the Amazon, you have to somehow recognize that by giving the Amazon economic status, and that means political power in a sense. So there are these different ways that we looked a bit in the paper, we talked about yesterday, and they carry certain risks. And it is difficult. It's not as simple as human diplomacy, because of course, if I accept that India is in the room, and I begin to talk to the Indian ambassador and listen to them, I can do that in the human medium. I can listen to a human voice describing another human place and the interests of that place, and I can talk back to that human representative of a human place and a human government and of national interests in that government. And it's still difficult because we have different interests, we have different understandings, different cultures, but it is essentially a human communication repertoire. If I do it with a flower, it's a much more complicated business. So there are risks in this. And the first one, of course, if you create an ocean embassy in Geneva for blue nature, or a water embassy, if you create a forest embassy in Geneva, if you have animal diplomats for different species joining you at the UN to represent and promote the interests of nature, like the wolf person or the person we had yesterday who does swans, that will instantly create power competition, which is a point that Aki made yesterday. And that power, which is intrinsic to diplomacy when you're always negotiating interests, will add a new dimension to international diplomacy. But of course, the second big risk of having that kind of diplomatic representation of nature is capture. It's political capture by those people who decide to represent it. And that capture can be cynical and it can be for profit. They can say, actually, if we represent the Amazon, we can make a lot of money out of the Amazon. Or it could be a deep ecology commitment and capture by deep ecologists who in their heart don't agree with what Aniedi said and think that actually the human species is a problem to the Earth and should be restricted in some way much more, and that nature has more rights than humans. So you can get a political capture in a bad way as well. And then thirdly, of course, you can get representative failure where you have people absolutely working in the best interests of nature, but not really understanding it and making mistakes, as politicians do when they misrepresent or misunderstand a community and represent it badly as well. And in many ways, the last two of those risks of capture and of misrepresentation, if you like, are called the problem of ventriloquism. If you remember, in a lot of old comedy acts, you'd have a human with a dummy on its knee, and the guy would have his knife shut, and he would try to talk to the dummy. And that is how anthropologists and diplomats worry about these risks, the risk of ventriloquism by human mediums for diplomacy. But I still think this is all an experiment worth trying, and that's what we're doing. And why do I think this initiative is worthwhile? And I'll talk for another 5 minutes, then we'll go into discussion. 3 reasons, really. First, because it's right. I really do believe it is morally and theologically right, as Aniedi argued, that we increase nature's diplomatic status and find ways to represent it diplomatically in our multilateralism. So we move to an all-life multilateralism and an earth community, which is the phrase of the great Thomas Berry, the Catholic theologian. Nature agencies, and we had them in the room yesterday, UNET, where Jean-Claude is in Nairobi, Worldwide Fund for Nature, IUCN, they do a great job. They are bringing nature to the table in some way, but they're also subservient to states in a way. They take state command. They are limited to states agreeing policy about nature. They work more as technical advisors. And I think we need more than that, because with that process, nature is talked about. It is a topic of diplomacy, not an interlocutor. It is not talked with. And I think that the extraordinary difference it would make for diplomats to actually face nature across the table would be totally different to facing WWF or UNEP if it had diplomatic status in some way. The second reason it's important is what Akim has hinted about, is that Geneva is looking for ideas. And as Akim rather powerfully said yesterday, Geneva is at risk of becoming a museum of multilateralism, a museum of the multilateralism of the 20th century and 19th century, unless it now recovers its innovative spirit and becomes more diplomatic and entrepreneurial again. And I think this is one way that Geneva could develop 21st century multilateralism. And I think Geneva is an obvious reason to do it because of the deep roots, and I use that ecological word deliberately, of multilateralism here, but also because it is one of the most beautiful multilateral hubs in the world. It's surrounded by nature, watching humans discussing humans and humans discussing itself, nature. And what better place? And I think when we do these conferences in the future, it would be lovely to do them not just with nature at the table, but in nature, because I think that will change the way. I tried to get it at the botanical gardens, but they don't have a meeting room. They have it for children, but not adults. So nature and Geneva, I think, should be happening. And, if I was to have a dream, it would be, and who knows who will be alive then, but if I came back in 2035, I would find a forest embassy draped with beautiful trees and greenery. I'd find some fabulous ocean and water embassy of some kind floating on the lake. That's where it was. And these kind of images, and I think that would be fabulous. And the third reason, of course, it's important, I think, to do this initiative is because you know what we scholars are like. We sit in our studies and we read our books and we write. We think we're having really good ideas. And we're going to write a book and say, but we must be right. And unless I bring my ideas to Geneva and to you and to states and diplomats and agencies like we did yesterday, I have no idea if it's practical, feasible, ridiculous, whatever. So it's an idea I believe needs to be really tested as well. Let me just tell you in a sense what we did yesterday so that you understand the context in which we're asking you to speak and to listen to you. We had a session yesterday which showcased, we had Professor Tom Oliver from Reading University who are doing a big project on nature-centric governance. How can you have governance which has nature much more at the center of parliamentary political policy thinking in governance in some way? And he talked about the different ways you can do it with interspecies councils, with nature as a shareholder, with nature on the board, and in parliamentary seats, etc., etc. We then listened to a fascinating account of one animal diplomat who's a woman called Sasha Dench, who was a scientist researching the migration of swans and geese. And she did it by flying in a gyrocopter for months, starting with the swan migrations and traveling hundreds of miles and touching down every now and again to see what the relationship was between people on the earth who are hunting, shooting, farming, whatever, and the swans. And she was doing this very scientifically, but of course she was flying with swans and showed us wonderful pictures. And a wonderful moment when two swans broke off from the main flock, and they both sat behind her on her wings in that V-shaped structure as if she were one of them and she was the lead swan. And she said that was the most extraordinary experience. So she did this, and then she went to report at the UN meeting on migratory species. And she started reporting as a scientist, and she realized that nobody was really listening to her when she spoke about data. So in her next presentation, she decided to speak sort of as a swan from the perspective, what it was like to be with these swans. And it completely changed the dimension and dynamic of the meeting and created a whole new engagement of scientists and of politicians. And that was fascinating to hear. And that was a great example of what an animal diplomat could do. And she was then made UN ambassador for migrating species to that UN process. We then listened more to the whole movement that Aniedi referred to about the rights of nature. That in a sense, and you were here at the Human Rights Council a lot, that what would it mean to have a rights of nature embedded alongside and within human rights? And of course, we heard from Ecuador, who have done that with their own constitution, talking about their experience of that and the court cases that arise of the little frog in that case, when the little frogs could take a mining company to court and win, because otherwise they would be extinct, and things like this. Panama talked to us about their plans to launch at the UNGA this year in September a universal declaration for the rights of Mother Earth. So to build on the Bolivian initiative from years ago and try and get a parallel Universal Declaration for the Rights of Nature alongside the Universal Declarations for Human Rights. We had a group from Antarctic Rights who were telling us about their plan in a way to create Antarctica as the first nature sovereign. To say this is a place where people don't live, but it's one of the most important places on Earth for its effect on Earth systems of all kinds. And they are beginning to argue, and they're launching a declaration in December for Antarctic rights and for somehow to get beyond the current treaty of states, which is so transparent and power play, to somehow recognizing Antarctica, perhaps giving it a seat at the UN, in some ways, the first nature sovereign. And then we listened to someone from the Amazon, well, from Ecuador, but talking about the same possibility for the Amazon as a biome, in the same way that Pope Francis talked about the great biome in Congo and West Africa, Central Africa, and the Amazon biome, and saying, you know, that runs across 9 states, and maybe it needs some kind of diplomatic status and some sort of overlapping sovereignty with those states. So we listened to that discussion too. We then, very interestingly, had people from Ville de Genève telling us about what's happening here on the doorstep. And we heard from them describing the movement for the Appel du Rhône, which is a movement from people who live all along the road, Rhône, trans-boundary communities from up in Lausanne near the source, right down through Switzerland, through France to the Camargue Delta. And where they are trying now to get a recognition similarly of a sort of trans-boundary entity called the Rhône in some way. And we heard for similar initiatives for the lake itself as well, in Ville de Genève, in the Conseil here. And then I'll shut up in a minute, but we then had very interesting discussions throughout about all these ideas. And in a sense, a lot of support. But that support, in a sense, was discussed in 2 ways. First of all, there was general support. Yes, use Geneva. This is a place where we should be, the phrase lab was used. We should be having a diplomatic laboratory here to experiment, to try things, as we've always done, to see what might work here. So there was positive encouragement to use Geneva for this initiative. There was a really interesting point made that, in a sense, we are talking about a paradigm shift, but we're already in the current rather statist, humanist paradigm of multilateralism. And the point was, don't rush to create the second, because you'll probably lose that battle. And there's a lot of good things we can do in the existing paradigm of multilateralism that begins to increase nature's status without destroying that and challenging it outright in a revolutionary way. And from those, we will probably birth a new Earth multilateralism paradigm eventually. And that was rather good, realistic advice, I think. The other main point to tell you, of course, and it's no surprise to you, is the challenge of the political context at the moment to drive this kind of initiative. And people talked about the headwinds of authoritarianism and the fact that America is at this moment trying to cross out climate change in the middle of the worst European heat wave of all time, you know, in certain resolutions. So this is a difficult time to do that. It also made the point that securing the rights of nature and this kind of new notions of nature as diplomat requires freedom of human rights to express that view, to go and argue for it, to protest about it, to take legal action in favor of it. And with an increasingly authoritarian political culture, those human rights of organizations like yours to protest, to argue, to promote will be increasingly cracked down on. So we are unlikely to achieve this new step for nature if human rights are shut down. So that was another key point. I'm probably going to leave it there because we want to hear from you. And you know, the purpose really now is to hear what you think about this. And if you think it's useful, how you as a faith-based diplomatic community could support it in the months ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll call on two theologians online. I'll go in alphabetical order. First, Father Anthony.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Hugo, for your thought-provoking presentation. A number of ideas ran through my mind as you were speaking, and I was taking a look at your paper. I'll just try and bring them up, not necessarily in a logical sequence. The first thing is for me to say we need to differentiate here between nature and person if this project is to go ahead. Nature is principle of vital action. Person is subject of vital action. I think that's a very important philosophical distinction that we need to make in this kind of conversation. It seems to me that nature is being reduced to earth, but nature is not earth, and earth is not nature. Nature is not earth alone, and earth is not nature. So we need to differentiate between nature and person. We need to differentiate between nature and earth. And it not be helpful to simply reduce nature to earth and ascribe the status of personhood to nature. Nature answers the question, what? Person answers the question, who? And with regard to the creation narrative, where God commanded the earth to bring forth fruit, to bring forth fruit, that does not mean God ascribed personhood to the earth. It doesn't mean God ascribed personhood to the earth. If the creation narrative were to be read carefully, personhood was ascribed to the human being by the act of creating the human being in the image and likeness of God, which is not something said of nature. Perhaps what we're saying about nature's personhood, perhaps we can say it by way of analogy. Certainly we must protect nature, but does nature have to be a diplomat before we can protect nature? A diplomat is a chosen representative of the person who has chosen him or her. So who will choose the diplomat for nature, and who will choose nature as diplomat? I think there's still a number of things to be differentiated in the discourse. Finally, I think the world already has too many huge bureaucracies. Are we trying to create another one? But really, from the philosophical angle, I would say the distinction between nature and person is blurred. It has been blurred since Descartes. From the theological perspective, I don't think there is any theological basis for ascribing personhood to nature. The personhood spoken of in scripture has to do with the human being created in the image and likeness of God. Those are the thoughts that run across my mind right now. I will still take a closer look at the paper and maybe share with you some other thoughts. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Dr. John Claude, could you turn on, okay.
Yes, thank you very much, Hugo, for this interesting paper. When I received it and I tried to go through it at night. My first impression was a mixed impression, mixed feeling, because as much as it is presented in a context of faith-based organizations, I did not see directly any argument, on a biblical argument or any biblical text that could kind of anchor what you are saying or your argument, but fine. And very, very seriously, what I missed to see was the method from where you are arguing. What is the method you are using to develop your argument? So I failed to see that. But good enough, at least this morning, I was a bit consoled when Father Aniedi introduced the background of this discussion, even quoting the case of Genesis and so on. So I said, okay, now I started seeing where faith is coming in. Now, in my own perspective as a student of sacred texts, been doing some research on ecology or biblical approach to ecology. And actually, I'm using a method called intercultural eco-justice hermeneutic. Intercultural eco-justice hermeneutics. There is already one introduction to the letter of Paul to Romans, published in an introduction to New Testament, an African introduction to New Testament, published this year in Minneapolis, Fortress Press. It's a collective work with different New Testament scholars in Africa. So that's where I also use that approach of intercultural eco-justice hermeneutics, whereby I use different frames to argue a case, to see the similarities and differences of those frames. Like Father Aniedi also mentioned in his introduction, I use, for instance, an ancient frame, like African tradition frame, or and a church frame, the interpretation of the same reality through the church history, using, for instance, church fathers and so on, encyclicals and so on, and also using the contemporary interpretations of the same reality, and then come to see what are the similarities and the differences. Now, when also Hugo talked after the introduction from Father Aniedi, what ensured me a bit was that he talked about the voice of nature. And actually that voice is one of the principles of ecological hermeneutics, like Earth, Mother Earth, including what, as all of us we know, including intrinsic value, interconnectivity, voice, mutual stewardship, purpose, and resistance. So, given that the nature itself, according to those principles, has a voice, the challenge now, as Father Anthony is posing, is who would mandate a person to be the diplomat or to be the representative of the nature. Nevertheless, I'm still of the opinion it can still be worked out, because there are people who are able to listen to that voice, to discern that voice from the nature. There are some people, like from the Hindus and so on, who are trained even to talk to the flowers, to talk to the plants, to listen to them. Even in Africa, some tribes like the Maasais, they go to talk in their area, for instance, to animals or to forest and so on. So they communicate. They have a way of communicating. So by that communication, they can enter into they can enter in the world of that nature and be able now to represent it at a diplomatic level. So that can be, I think from now I'm trying to see how it can be argued. However, it will take time and also argument and so on. I see, but in other words, I think that it is possible. Then another thing. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, Jean-Claude.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would want to reiterate what Professor Anthony said. one of the statements that the Vatican Embassy made on the right to development was to clearly distinguish between this, because there are people who were pushing to place nature and the human person on the same path. And their statement was to the fact that that has to be properly distinguished. I'm not going into that. I'm just only referencing that. Then this is my own point. Again, the basic question, who represents nature? Is it nature or us? Okay. If it is us, would that qualify as proper representation? You know, why do we think we're better qualified to do that? And the understanding of nature, like when Father Aniedi was talking about, you know, God created this nature and saw that it was good. Yeah, that is correct. But then that is not the superlative. It could be better. It could be best. So that it is good doesn't mean we have achieved, you know, what nature should achieve. And somehow the letter to the Romans would like to disappoint us on this, because it says that the whole creation is eagerly waiting for God to reveal his sons. It was not for any fault on the part of creation that it was made unable to attain its purpose. So it's like inherent in this nature we are fighting is a mechanism that restrains all of us. That I cannot fly is a reality. There is also things nature cannot, you know, be able to accomplish. How do we work that out? So we are locked up in this dilemma of people seeking to become. And what has been proposed as the best alternative or the best way we resolve our situation in this is this understanding of integral ecology, how we are all related. And it's a very nice buzzword, you know, to talk about integral ecology, you know, that we are all interconnected. Very wonderful. But I want to go a step further to ask, how are we interconnected? And if we want to deconstruct this, you have to look at what this connection means. That in any ecological setting, there are two major actors, the prey and the predator. We miss the point if we overlook these intervening factors in every creation. And whether you can bring that into the human sphere, for instance, to talk about, you know, this ecological living and all whatnot. I'll ask you the question, who is the prey? And who is the predator? Okay? And I know from my own experience coming from Africa, for instance, that in relation to human trafficking, for instance, I know that our women, you know, move from our region, this region of poverty, to another region. So it is clearly defined. Who controls the economy of the world? Okay. Now, it is becoming more and more anthropocentric, you know, this kind of discussion. That's the fear. It's an ambitious project. But then, when we have to decide for nature, are we not going to get into this problem of, you know, what we do in migration? For instance, in United Kingdom, they are worried about the rhubarbs, the rhubarbs that came from somewhere, you know, overshadowing the local ones. Okay? When you go to your farm to do the normal things you do, why do you consider the other nature a weed and the other one is to be selected? These are the issues. So when we talk about nature, we talk as if we have been very innocent in representing every nature. We still choose what we consider weed to be removed and what we consider things that should be allowed. This is the problem. It happens in the human sphere, and with nature, it's also going to happen. This is my own way of looking at it. Thank you.
Okay. Just a reflection so far from political scientists. There are three things that I think I would like to initiate a reflection on. One is the very importance of faith-based actors in this discussion, because a lot of the pushback against the representation of nature is going to come from an order that has grown out of the Westphalian system of states, which is currently has its manifestation in the UN system that is dominated by member states. And the reason why faith-based organizations are important, because you can literally argue and had legitimately argued that the Westphalian system is a relatively recent invention to other types of organization of faith-based and political community, partly because you are so much older than the Westphalian system. That gives the voice of faith-based organization another legitimacy in this discussion. Because this is a very peculiar type of order that has not always existed. This is the first point. The second point is something that I'm learning, or I learn. You have an inbuilt relationship to what is human and what is nature, because everything has been created by God. That gives your voice in this discussion of nature representation a certain type of legitimacy. Whether this is the same conception in other faiths, in the Muslim world, in the Buddhist world, in other faiths, I don't know. But I'm sure many of you will know. And the third point then comes to the issue of legitimizing pathways for representativeness. If governments and states are saying, who are you to legitimately represent nature? Then the question is, what are the legitimizing pathways that can in fact legitimize a nature representation? And if one would herewith imagine that the faiths of this world have come together to endow a human representation of nature and give that an institutional manifestation, that is very hard to beat for states, that this has no legitimacy. So a legitimizing process, I wouldn't call it as a conclave for the representation of nature. But if we want to look at legitimizing representation, faith-based actors have a unique voice to say, well, in fact, we, out of our responsibility to represent God's words, who represents both human and nature, we have in fact come together to endow this space with legitimacy from where we come from. And I want to see the reaction of states, what they're going to say against that.
Okay, thank you. Sister?
No, it makes me ponder a lot also, because I have been in places where I have seen destruction of nature. I witnessed Haiyan, and we tried to rebuild areas where there was destruction. I have been to several islands. I have been also to Myanmar, where I have experienced Nargis, that one that buried islands and villages and killed a lot of people. For me, I think nature speaks out loud itself. We only heard some days ago what happened to the Philippines earthquake and to Venezuela. They are double earthquakes, no? But to think, I would like to take the point of Father Anthony, where we ask the question, what is nature diplomat? and who is nature diplomat. I think there is a difference of what and who. Okay? And because here if we talk of a diplomat, it's someone that can give a voice to where it is lacking, to someone that can represent, that needs something that would really need to reconstruct and transform society, nature. And then I believe nature perhaps rebels, and we have seen it many times. But no human being states, are they sensitive enough as persons to be able to address what nature is saying? It is already speaking. It also comes down. But how many? When it comes down, we are all happy. Now we are experiencing heat wave here, okay? Heat wave, and everybody's complaining. And they are blaming everybody, or scientists, or lack of education, okay? So I think human beings must know what is resilience, and nature itself will give its fruit. I have also I have worked in Cambodia, Myanmar, Vietnam, and they are Buddhist countries. And they really, I have seen children, they don't destroy flowers. Because for them, flowers are a gift they offer to Buddha, okay? So when they see them on the ground, they don't touch it. Maybe here or somewhere else, it's just like an object, but they treat it with a sense of sacredness. I think what we need more is a sense of education to the sacredness of life, as Father Aniedi was mentioning. When everything after creation, and they say, there is life, and God says it is good. But I think we have to distinguish what is life and who speaks life and who gives life. And as you also mentioned, something that sustains life, okay? And I think this is, what we are all called, because as Father Kachi also mentioned, when we talk of the right to development, the argument there is that who opposes the right to development? Who are contrary to the right to development? Yeah. They are the developed, rich countries who oppose the right to development. And those who are fighting for it are those who need to survive. And yet, those who seem to address the survival of others are the ones that are oppressing the survival of others. So how can they develop? So I think this is a crucial point, but there are other crucial matters to address. They would not even legitimize as a convention the right of youth. And how can we legitimize the right of an environment if we cannot speak the right of a person and we cannot even protect the right of a child? So I agree that we need to protect nature, but I think we have to find the balance when we speak, when the balance of what we present, whom are we representing? Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sister Frank. I see you were nodding.
Yes. I want to bring us back to some natural thing that took place here. I don't know how many of us noticed it, but I know you did, and I looked at you, and before you invited us to silence and be present to each other, there was a natural silence that I could hear, I could feel it, and I looked, and I was glad to be connected with him. And that was an act of nature. We didn't invite it. It was freely given, before you then invited us. But when you invited us, I did not experience the solemnity, that I experienced when the first experience. I don't know how to put it again, but I thank God for that presence. And to pick up on what Sister said, during the Human Rights Council, the first day or the second day, there was a conversation on international solidarity. And I sat in that mighty room. And the only people that were making comments were the Africans, the Asians, the South Americans. And I said, I wanted, I said, if it was something that one could raise up their hand, I could have been very bold and said, please, just listen to me. But I had to follow the protocols. So when we are talking about nature here, I do agree. The idea you are bringing up is a very beautiful idea, but the conversation must include not just us from this table, but go beyond this table. Because from where I come from, nature and tradition is very much respected. Even now, against the presentation of Christianity and academic values, people, at the grassroots, they still strongly believe, in the power of nature, and they live it. But some of these has been, kind of pushed to the periphery because of certain values presented by education, presented even by our faith. For instance, if we said, like our natural people in Nigeria, I read stories of how traditional shrines were destroyed. But these were places where nature was acknowledged and represented and lived through. So when we have to do this conversation, we also have to bring in the people who truly understand what nature is about and how we can go back, to re-educate our children to value what the importance of nature is. In February, we had some workshop. It was about the protection of environments. And how did we do it? We had to bring in traditional rulers. I didn't know how they would respond, but, they were very alert. To think that, for me, a woman, within a context where men are so powerful that before 11 o'clock, the traditional ruler would have gathered all the councils and they were there waiting. And we went with little girls of secondary school age and we presented, our advocacy act, and they listened. And we did that in 3 places. It was on the protection of the environment, an environment that in the past used to be so beautiful, but now bad governance has destroyed it, consumption has destroyed it, everything else has destroyed it. How can we bring this back? And there was great cooperation. So, and after that, now, these traditional rulers are now working very closely with these schools from their different. So this is a little grassroots act that will make a change. And these young people that attended this, they need to be well supported and pushed, by the wisdom of adults. Otherwise, they will be left to float. So I encourage the conversation. I like the conversation, but it will not happen just with us from this table. Maybe we can be ambassadors, to link up people. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, you have your hands up? Yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm a person of faith, or I would identify as a person of faith, but I'm not a trained theologian, but a political scientist. And probably my two remarks that I would have with that lens or framework or topic, if you want to call it. The first one is a or relates to a discussion and to an earlier publication by Hugo in your book on Humanitarianism 2.0, and to the discussion there that we discussed in the review phase a bit. What is the right strategy? And at the time you opted there for a strategy of saying a mainstreaming of an environmental or nature dimension into the principles, into the humanitarian principles, and then that way developing them further would be the more promising approach rather than a standalone approach for a principle of environmental principle within the humanitarian principles, for example. And I think you've argued that well in the book. Now this sounds a bit like the other way of doing it. Now you seem to be proposing more of a standalone approach here in this case of representation. Now I know these are two different levels. One is the question of principle, and the other is the agency level. But I'd be curious to hear a bit more of your reasoning why you think. In this case, especially at agency level, an approach of standalone representation would be more promising than an approach of, may I call it mainstreaming or whatever, that you've argued in that other publication stuff. The second one is around what has been mentioned, especially, or what has been mentioned by Hugo, but also been taken up by Achim. I'm a child of social constructivism, I'd say, and then, of course, you've argued that this whole issue of diplomatic representation as it currently stands, and you've said that the whole Australian system as such are, of course, socially constructed systems that are predated by faith systems or other forms of organizing internationally. If that is the case, then for me the question of also of mandate to represent nature diplomatically is, of course, as well socially constructed, and that's because I have a hard time imagining how representation of nature would come about if not socially constructed by humans. And then that for me then begets two questions. One is the question of accountability. To whom would representatives of nature be accountable? And you refer to that in the different potential problems, but that's one. But the other is the question of recognition in international law, because subjects of the international system, basically, they need to be recognized, socially accepted by others. I mean, everyone can say, "Oh, I've now founded state A, B, and C in my little kingdom or whatever." As long as the others in the system say, "Forget about it, we're not going to recognize you," then you don't exist, basically. And that would be my question. Even if there's the push from faith act, or even collective joint push from faith actors, Achim, that you mentioned, if it's not recognized by anyone, everyone would say, "Okay, nice idea, it's also compelling and so on, but we don't recognize you as a subject." Then what? So I don't want to sound negative about this, but I think for me, these are still the two elements that, especially the question of of indirect representation and social construction of such representation that we need to wrestle with, and maybe also come up with good answers, because in principle, I'm very sympathetic to the idea and to the cause. But I think these are two elements that we still need to get better. Sorry for going into lecture mode.
No, there are many questions here. I know there are many hands upcoming. So I want to take a break by having Hugo respond to some of the questions or some of the issues. Then we continue with the following questions.
Is that all right?
Is that okay
I thought we
you?
would have a roundtable, but it's becoming a bit like a seminar. So let me just respond a bit, and that might create a new wave of discussion, and you can still say your piece there. But thank you all very much for taking this seriously. I mean, it's interesting, actually, just the difference between the two roundtables, because this one is much more innately thoughtful and reflective, actually, whereas the other one yesterday was much more about sort of positioning and things. So it's really helpful for me, especially as I want to write a book on this, so that and to hear this balance of views is really helpful. Professor Anthony, I'm very, I understand exactly what you're saying, and I think I don't totally agree, actually, because I do find personhood in nature as well, and I'm not prepared quite to make that fierce distinction between human who and nature what, in a sense. And I do think one of the interesting things about being alive today in a nature emergency is that actually we somehow do recognize the personhood in the beautiful things around us in some way. And I realize it's inevitably qualitatively different personhood, but I'm just not completely convinced we're not, in a sense, having something else revealed to us at this moment. Which many of us have always known, in a sense. So I understand what you're saying very much, and I'm just not totally convinced, in the sense that we can make a rigid separation that way. But I really agree with you. I mean, and I've hesitated about this, about the creation of another bureaucracy. I have enormous sympathy with you for that, because I can't bear bureaucracies and I can't survive in them. The most I've ever done is 5 years, And I would be very reluctant to do that. And I think you're absolutely right about that risk. And that's something we have to think about carefully. The only thing I would say is that there's already an enormous nature bureaucracy anyway in UNEP, WWF, the CBD treaty process, etc. So if in some way this one could absorb some of that and even thin it down a bit, that might be good. And Jean-Claude, thank you very much. There's no theological method in the background paper, because it was for a diplomatic community primarily. So that paper was sort of for yesterday. And I'm glad Aniedi gave it theological depth this morning. The whole question of the voice of nature, I mean, I really understand what you're saying, and it's been common to a lot of comments. And of course, when we use the word voice of nature, we are still at the moment talking symbolically and metaphorically. We're using a metaphor in that way, in the way that we do about God as well. When we find something that is so cognitively different at one level for us, we can only relate to it through love and through metaphorical language in some way, when we're talking often about God in that way. So that problem exists, but I think that I agree with you, Jean-Claude, that we still shouldn't give up at that point. We need to think very hard about who would mandate this voice and how possible it is. And I think listening to the Swan Diplomat yesterday and reading the Wolf Diplomat and that sort of thing, I think with certain animal species, but increasingly when you read science about flowers and oceans and big ecosystems, it is, as Sister was saying, it's really, nature's voice is there. It is possible to hear it, to understand it, to have insight into it. So I think, I'm glad you feel it's not a totally lost cause to explore the metaphor of voice in some way. Yesterday, the nature academics were talking about connectedness, nature connectedness, and how we find that and speak from it in some way. So it is quite similar to faith, actually. in the challenge of ultimate difference at one level. And with nature, we don't have the incarnation in a sense, of course, but we have something. And the church has always recognized that very profoundly, I think. I'm really interested in your points, Father, about sort of prey and predator and the natural order of limits of being. You know, that flower it has natural limits to what it can do. And we have natural limits to what we do, and we can't fly and that sort of thing. And I think that's really interesting, because in terms of world order, it then means, it could possibly mean that some species could obviously never be diplomats. Obviously, that's what we do. But I don't think that stops us from thinking, how could we do that with them and for them in some way as other species? And that's what's going on a lot in nature diplomacy anyway. So, but these are very profound and important points, I think. I tend to agree with Akim that if faith got behind it, and we saw that with Pope Francis and Laudate Si, when he really embraced nature and the earth and the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth, we really saw that, as Akim said, whoa, that had surprising political impact, actually, not just at state level, but actually in terms of human society across the world. Lots of people who weren't Christians or Catholics nodded their head and respected that authority, even though it came from a different tradition. So I think that's quite interesting, what the potential you all have. And then, Sister, your point about nature speaking already, and the real importance of the sanctity of nature and somehow bringing that forward and representing it. And then, Sister Franca, you gave a beautiful example of how young people, in a sense, brought forward the sanctity of nature to their chiefs. And I would call that diplomacy at one level. So I would say that is sort of nature as diplomat, and they were really good diplomats in that case. And that's the sort of thing I think we can try and achieve. If we can. Thorsten, it's a really good point. I was very lucky. So Thorsten, when I wrote this last book, I had a review group of 6 people, and Thorsten was one of them. And he's a professor really in his own right. He's so in political science, and he was really good. And I did make the point then that I thought we should mainstream nature into humanitarianism, and we should say that the principle of humanity should be changed to protect and respect humanity and nature together, because we are mutual life. And so I was going for a full-on, as you say, integrated change there. The reason I'm being, I suppose, slightly tactically different here, there are 2 reasons. First, because I think there's a particular threat to nature in current diplomatic understandings, where people basically have decided to attract the attention of economists with nature. So they're just saying, oh, these are just ecosystem services. This is like nature capital. So we can use it and respect it, and obviously we have to keep it going because we want to use it again. So it's a very utilitarian approach to nature that is dominating diplomatic discussion. I think that's really dangerous. If we had that for human life, saying, oh, well, no, we can use these people because they create production and that sort of thing, they're just services, we would go, whoa, no, we can't do that. We need some kind of special, exceptional representation for that group because they are being used as a means, not an end, in Kantian terms for the Germans at the table. So that's why there's an exceptional threat to nature in current diplomatic paradigm that we need to address. And then the second reason I make an exception in this case is because diplomacy needs performance. The diplomatic arena is essentially a ritual space which requires performance of some kind. I'm Great Britain, I'm UK, I'm Nigeria. It's rubbish, isn't it? I mean, I'm a bit, but I'm not. And that's why I make the case for having nature as diplomats here, because that performance is required in diplomacy as diplomatic culture has emerged. So that's and it's really helpful for me, this. So thank you so much. And I don't know if it's wasting your time, but yeah.
Yeah, many thanks, many thanks to you for a very rich discussion. I wanted to, in fact, agree on your point. I mean, we all agree that there's an urgency to basically preserve and save nature, which is under a lot of threats and stress. However, if we give nature let's say, a voice and identity in the current system, the current multilateral systems, which is this basically destroying nature. I think there's a risk of basically having nature on the table, but basically within the system which is not responding to what we need. And I was thinking maybe, the kind of traditional societies or, indigenous people society, nature is at the core of the governance because nature is within, basically the kind of connection with nature is in each and any individual. And maybe, yes, nature is on the table as a voice, but it's an inner voice within each and any of these, the person who is a member of this society, because of a very strong connection with nature, and because these societies know that without this connection to nature, they are going to disappear, basically. And I was thinking that maybe a more ambitious approach would be how we reconnect the current system we have and the current societies we have with nature. And therefore, nature is not just one voice around the table, but nature is a common voice for all of us, and I think that's where we need to be, because I think with your suggestion, your proposition, Hugo, and once again, I very much agree with the rationale, but I agree with your point that the risk is maybe to have nature being said as, okay, nature is becoming the 195th actor on this table, and therefore will still be neglected. And therefore, how can we maybe also move to a place where nature is within each and any of us, to basically have nature at the core of the governance of the multilateral system. And where I see this also connecting with, what you are saying regarding faith-based organization with faith values is, I think it should connect very much with how we can put values back at the core of the multilateral system, rather than, legal text and this convention and that convention and so on and so forth, because that's how the Westphalian order works, but that doesn't work, in fact, as we can see with more and more violations of all kinds of rights and violations of fundamental values. And so for me, it's how we put back values at the core of the multilateral system, which can help us to achieve what we would like to achieve. And here, as you were saying, I mean, the encyclical Magnificas, Humanitas. Yeah. Humanitas. Humanitas, yes. I think provide us a lot of guidance on how to do it, how to approach it. And I think that's where we need maybe to start. So I think how we record, what can we learn from the governance of indigenous societies, traditional societies, on how they were connected to nature, how we can extrapolate this to a kind of global governance, and how we can do this through putting values at the core of the multilateral system, rather than just adding nature as a voice. That would be my kind of early thought on this, but I agree that there's an urgency of doing this.
I think it's a really interesting approach.
For example, where recently at the Human Rights Council, we have now a special rapporteur on climate change. We have also on the environmental, but it's like it's useful, but at the same time it's pigeonhole climate change and environment in something which is very specific, whether it should be something which is mainstream. I remember vividly following the conference, and it was on climate change, but the person was making the point that all our human rights are being burnt and being flooded, or being burned and flooded at the same time, because we don't address climate change. So it's, it should not be something which is pigeonholing one or two mandates. It should be something which is at the core of all that we do.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, very very quick. Most of the reflections we do agree on that, and particularly in Franciscan practice, we've been working very closely with the topic of rights to nature. We had some workshops and reflections on that. So then we had some questions mainly on the reflections on the synergies of the different movements giving a voice to nature. So the first one is that since we've been going the recognition of the nature as a right holder, it is really interesting to understand your views on if these can be kind of somehow, not necessarily, but a prerequisite to then have status like in the UN or the Diplomat. Because as it was mentioned, of course, like the subjects of law needs to be changed, like the system needs to be changed in that sense. So that's one reflection. And the other one is like, as mentioned by our colleague, the Geneva system is already working a lot on the right to a healthy and clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So what are the relationships that you are looking at if we're bringing the voice to nature should be within that system of the already right to healthy and sustainable environment, which is still at the council struggling to be recognized? Or is it something different? Which are the best spaces, especially in Geneva, where human faith-based organizations can actually advocate? Is it with special rapporteur and like these topics, or should it be differently, or like how we can see the synergies within all of these spaces, so we can bring like one cohesive.
Okay. Having your hands up.
Yeah.
Actually,
building very much on your points there, and thank you so much for the contributions and the following discussion. I think I really agree with the point around maybe not having an individual bureaucratic system and its own flags and its own kind of territorial power struggle within spaces such as the Human Rights Council. We can see it's increasingly difficult to reach an agreement in these spaces, and we've been engaging this week with many of our members, and how often these issues are siloed into different spaces. How we've been talking with our members this week is how do we build the bridges between the bridges? How do we become that interlocutor that I think people also spoke to earlier? And I think nature is such an amazing space that can connect people and struggles and issues, and it's in every space. So something we've done within our work, particularly on gender justice, was working with member states and strengthening their religious literacy so that they could understand how to work with religious communities and faith communities on gender equality specifically. And I wonder whether there's something similar around how do we work with member states in the Geneva context so that they can discern the voice of nature. And I really like the word discernment that came up early in the discussion around how can our member states discern nature with those rights that we want to affirm, and that they can then bring it into the performance space. As you say, and the Human Rights Council is definitely a performance in many spaces these days. How can we ensure that then, my family from Ireland and in the UK, how can I ensure that my country representation can also represent the nature voice and discernment in that? And I really appreciated your case study Daniel, around the grassroots. How do we make sure this is actually from the grassroots upwards, rather than thinking about what could be the institutional flag and diplomat and that? But how do we start with saying, well, nature's in our communities, and particularly in the faith communities, we are rooted in some of the most local and rural and remote and hard to reach communities. How can we, as faith actors, ensure that we listen and learn and are able to support our member states, discern the voices of those that are really living with the climate emergency on the front line? Thank you.
Really helpful too.
So we have some people on the line trying to, yes, please. Cecilia? Okay, please unmute yourself. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the contributions. Well, the lady that just finished spoke. It actually jolted a need to speak about what we have done. I'm from the University of Manchester. I'm an academic in the Earth and Environmental Sciences. So what we had done this year was to see how we could connect the communities within Greater Manchester to have this kind of discussion. Because what happened is that although we have the Bishop of Salford Diocese in charge of the Laudato Si Center in the UK, Laudato Si, as a project in the UK. This is not so common. Not many people know about what they do and how they do it. So the project we had at hand from the university, from the Earth and Environmental Sciences Department, was to connect with other people who might be doing similar work within the UK. And first and foremost was to realize that at the Faculty of Humanities, we have the theology department that we're working on aspects of this, but we're so disconnected because we didn't know. I'm a scientist, but nevertheless, I have no idea what other people talk about. When there was a mention of ecosystem services, yeah, somebody will say, okay, the earth is for us to encroach, but for us as scientists as well as Catholics, we were looking at how can we bring other people into the discussion such that we protect our common good. So we brought in the religious, we brought in academics, and we also brought in other members of the public, including the Laudato Si Research Center, and then we brought Climate and Spirit Group, so that with the different interest groups, different people, non-governmental organizations, including CAFOD, we can have a discussion that we could take forward. And one of the key things that came out was the fact that within the faith communities, these are very limited discussions because there are not many people who are confident enough to say within the space they have, within their masses or within their subgroups. So, and what we were also looking to establish is that this is not a science-themed discussion. This is not a humanities-based themed discussion. This is an integrated discussion that needs everyone to come onto the table. So at the moment, there are opportunities for strengthening communities, which we have already started. But it's taking it forward, now becomes a difficult thing because how will the priests, how will they respond? How, with their own peculiar parish problems? And then even within the science group, how can we go further without, for me, thinking that some of my department people will say, okay, you are not a theologian, so how can you merge some of these things? So I think it raises a lot of questions that these things are happening, but it needs also other strong support to take this forward beyond just the nucleus of Manchester. Thank you.
Thank you. Father Fred, I see you turn on your mic. You have something to say, so we can.
Okay. I want to begin by saying that the presentation of conceiving the earth as a diplomat is great. But the idea, though it is great, has some points of convergence and divergence with Christian theology. And this is what I mean. It raises question on the understanding of sea worship and personhood. With regards to personhood, there is a distinction that needs to be made. There's a distinction between creation as a person and human person as a person. So the way that the whole thing is going is more towards the idea of creation as a human person, not in a sense of creation personhood. And if you carry that on, because that is, it is upon that the whole question of rights, of being able to speak or being able to sue, would come up. And if you carry that further, it will not bring some kind of blow, dimension to the whole idea of pneuma, the breath that God gave the human person upon creating him, in Genesis account, and the whole idea of imago Dei, and if you carry it further, if one will be able to, if Amazon forest will be able to sue, Amazon forest will, inevitably has rights, by that very fact, and also should also have responsibilities, and also will be culpable, to answer claims like if a place is burnt, should be able to answer to those things that are done. And it also raises question to the whole idea of sin, of incarnation, and then redemption. So if it is culpable, to offenses, then it's a moral agent. And if we raise that question further, it will question the whole idea of incarnation and redemption. So if Christ coming only assumed the aspect of person in terms of humans, then what now happens to the aspect of nature as humans or as persons? But it's a great idea, but we need to look more into it and fine-tune it better. Thank you.
Okay. I've given her had a sound before, then you. Sorry, is okay. Please.
Just very briefly, as an idea of what might be next in this reflection, we are of course a university here, and we could play out nature representation. We could establish a group of about 20 students that would train for half a year to represent swans, the ocean, and we have them have meetings and convene, and in a sense go towards if there is a model United Nations that happens at the United Nations, or young people playing out the model UN, we could play out a model species UN. What would it look like? And they all each have to then report on their experience of being a nature diplomat. So that's as much as a performance as you might call for. And with this words, I do have to apologize that I would need to take my leave from you, because I have an aging father in southern Germany that I visit every 6 weeks, and I have to take my train. So
good luck with the trains.
Well, it's Swiss trains.
Oh, good! Thank heavens, not German ones. No, okay.
I'd like to say that I'm a firm believer in the diversity of perspectives, and I always say that for those who study what is international Geneva and who do not see the wealth of diversity of representation in this town beyond UN member states, they don't get to see. And the faith-based representations is one very big part of that. And I do apologize. It's very, very
hosty.
Unhosty. I derogate my hosting by.
Okay. Thank you, Akim, for setting it all up. And yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Actually, as you are going, you were talking about bringing in faith communities. And I want just to say that, in fact, the continental conferences of bishops of Africa, Asia Pacific, and South America are already on this. At COP, the UN convention in Brazil, COP 30 last year, they showed up in person. The presidents of the continental bishops showed up in person in Brazil, and they were taking up this issue. And one of the sessions they conducted was what is the word here? The reparation and justice for nature. And in fact, this year, they have followed up, they have just issued another document titled Land for Life, Life for Peace. On it, these are the 3 continental bishops conferences are focusing on that. So I remember one thing, especially during the ecumenical session, one of the, please feel free, one of the indigenous representation at the ecumenical setting kept crying out, a young lady, oh, we need to understand a relationship. She kept using that word, relationship with nature, relationship. And I think for us we have to a little step away from the Western mindsets. To understand. I mean, I seem to have been the one person in the room who was following her, but we have to step away from the Western mindset in our conception of land, earth, and stuff in terms of utilitarian aspect of it. So she kept talking about relationship. And it is in that context that when I said initially ascribing personhood to nature, I'm talking about a relationship here. And there has to be an other for me to relate to, an object, another person to relate to. So that's what I don't talk of personhood in terms of mind, body, soul, no, but a relationship. And thirdly, going back to the scripture, when God put man in the middle of the garden to cultivate, nurture, and take care of it, it was establishing the right of governance to humans. And governance, at least in the divine context, a governor is a caretaker. A governor is a caretaker. And a governor, one of the primary duty of government is to protect what is entrusted to him or her. And to use the weight of that office to defend those who cannot defend themselves, and to speak on behalf of those who have, quote, no voice at the table. So that's the responsibility of a governor and governance. So it is from that aspect that I'm talking about the weight relationship, personhood, because there has to be an identity of, quote, X for me to relate to defend. So I just want to clarify that aspect. Okay.
We need to start wrapping up.
Yes, we have to start. So
thank you, Akim, again.
Word.
Well, I don't want the last word because I really found this very helpful, and I really think it's important what I forgot your name. Sorry, is Rachel and Michelle were saying, which is partly what Torsten was saying as well, that it would be a mistake just to make nature the 195th member of a failing system, in a sense. I think that's a really powerful point. So actually, if we could learn all to be the voice of nature, our multilateralism would be better. And then thinking, I can't disagree with Cecilia at Manchester, of course, because Manchester's about to run my country. So I'm just getting ready for Manchester rules. So anything that's said from Manchester, and they're going to have a 10 Downing Street in Manchester as well now. So, I mean, I can't disagree publicly with Ms. Cecilia. But you're absolutely right, of course, to say that this must be a very integral approach, both in who's involved and how we talk about it. And that is difficult, but it's similar to what Rachel and Michelle are saying. So that's very helpful. And Fred, you came into bat, I'm using a cricket, with the question of personhood and Professor Anthony's original point, and of course that stays with me, and that is a challenge, and Aniedi's talking about it too in the Imago Dei and this fundamental commitment we have in our Christian faith. And I've been using and I think the point that Aniedi makes about relationship is very important, because it does determine, in a sense, what is a subject and a subject at some level, rather than a subject and an object. And I've been using this phrase, nature as neighbor, which I feel I can draw from Laudate Si, because Pope Francis makes it very clear in a way that we need to update the parable of the Good Samaritan and say, if we see a suffering drying up river or a burning forest or a suffering animal, that is our neighbor too. So in a sense, it is an extension to Jesus's answer in Luke to the lawyer, who is my neighbor. And I think our current answer, that there are rights of nature, as there are rights of every human people and dignity, I do feel there's some kind of revelation in play here for us. So that's why I'm wobbling on the traditional line that Anthony and Fred are rightly sort of defending, I suppose. But again, if we say neighbor, then that brings us straight into diplomatic territory, because the whole challenge of diplomacy is to engage with our human neighbors. And that almost defines diplomacy. What's it about? It's about how we create relationships with human neighbors organized as states. And yeah, so there's been so much to think about, and I'm very grateful to you all so much, and to Aniedi and Enka and Cynthia for setting this up with Lucas. And what we'll do is we'll go on with the project one way or the other. And I think Akim is keen to do something else in Geneva. That's one idea I hadn't heard before, the model UN. I think he wants to convene the group we had yesterday a bit larger. And hopefully we'll find the right answer in the end, which will probably not, as Rachel rightly says, be sort of embassies sitting in the middle of Lake Geneva for the sea, but will be something that gets the voice of nature somehow into diplomacy somehow.
Diplomats, children.
Well, quite like Sister Franca's, yeah.
Like in India.
I think ambassador is a good word. Yeah.
Yes, because like in India, just an example, they have created children parliaments.
Exactly, yeah.
And with these children parliaments, they are able to do business. And ask local authorities also to act on it. So like they were able to build their communities, bring light, electricity to their village. So I think if we say like, because when you say diplomats, it already gives you a sense.
Exactly,
of a
status.
level that is another level. But maybe you start with nature ambassadors, like with the Laudato Si. They give you already a sense of connectedness, that we are connected to the people and we are bringing something.
I agree with that. There's one sort of worry in my mind that keeps me on the embassy and the lake vibe. Because at the moment in our country, you know, we're trying to get a new prime minister, and I was so shocked the other day, because we always are. I was so shocked the other day because they sort of put up the 10 key things this new prime minister would have to address. And I was saying to Michelle, climate was not on it. And I'm just thinking, that's absurd, you know. And could that have been possible if in the UK Parliament in Westminster, there were 10 MPs for rivers, 10 MPs for forests? Could that have been possible? And I don't think so. So I think representation makes a difference.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks for those connecting online. Dr. John Flood, Professor Ken Wallace, Father Fred, Cecilia, and all of you. Thank you, Quaker Union. Thank you very much, and thanks for all of you for being around. It was a very stimulating discussion. I think we could have gone on for another 15, 20 minutes, but we have to bring it to the end. Please,